Good evening. Tonight's story is not fiction. It's a real case, dark, unsettling, told step by step for those who remain awake when the world outside is quiet. If stories like these keep you listening, subscribe, like, and tell me where you're tuning in from. Now, lock your front door, lie down, let the AC hum. Pull the blanket close, but leave one foot uncovered. Science shows it helps your body cool down and fall asleep faster. Rain begins. At first, a faint tap on the window, then a steady rhythm. In less than 5 minutes, her familiar walk home turned. But tonight's story isn't about vanishing into thin air. It's about the slow unraveling of a family that trusted too much, and a son who mistook love for control. The town was Duncan, Oklahoma, where every Friday night light flickered above the same football field, where neighbors waved because everyone knew everyone. On October 9, 2014, peace was broken in a way that still haunts the quiet streets lined with maples. John and Joy Hruby were respected, known for their small newspaper, for Sunday greetings, for never locking the door. Their daughter Catherine was 17, bright, restless, always humming a tune while washing her car in the driveway. Their son, Alan, was 19, a college freshman who had already learned how to wear charm like a Suey. That morning began with nothing unusual. A cloudless Oklahoma sky stretched over Bent Tree Street. John left for work before sunrise. Joy made coffee, waved to her daughter, and thought of the weekend ahead. Somewhere north, in Norman, Alan sat in his dorm room, scrolling through his phone, staring at photos of watches, hotels, cars. The images looked real, but the money behind them wasn't. He had learned to pose as someone he wished to be. Friends saw him as polished, ambitious, a student with taste. They didn't know the bills were written in his parents' names. Beneath the surface, Around noon, Alan started the drive back to Duncan, 90 miles of highway turning into a tunnel of thoughts he wouldn't share with anyone. The sound of the tires masked the plan forming inside his head. He'd been here before, charmed his way out of trouble, smiled in court, promised to change. But this time, something colder had taken root. When he pulled off the interstate, the air smelled of rain and mesquite. He parked his Jeep near the edge of Bent Tree Street, far enough that no neighbor would notice. Inside the glove box, a small instrument waited taken from his father's truck days earlier. He checked it once, twice. The weight felt final. Inside the house, Joy wiped the counter and turned toward the back door when she heard it open. There was no scream loud enough to stop what had already begun. By the time the first sound reached the walls, the neighborhood remained silent. Catherine was outside, water running over the hood of her car, her hair damp from drizzle. She might have heard a noise, maybe thought it was thunder. When she walked in, the world she knew ended within seconds. By nightfall, no one knew that 3 lives had been taken. The house lights glowed as if everything was normal. A paper rested on the front porch. The mailbox held letters that would never be opened. Far north, on a college campus, friends believed Alan was preparing for the Oklahoma-Texas weekend. He posted photos of the stadium, a caption about friendship, hashtags about home. The screen shimmered with false comfort. Outside, the rain turned heavier, washing the streets clean but not the truth. It would take 4 days for the quiet to break, for a housekeeper to step inside and call 911, her voice trembling, saying the words no one wanted to believe. That discovery will come later. For now, remember the sound of rain on glass, the hum of air through a locked vent, and the truth that evil doesn't always arrive from the outside. Sometimes, it's born within the walls we trust most. Rain still touched the windows of Duncan that week, a slow rhythm that carried through quiet streets and hollow rooms. The town had not yet realized what had been lost, but the echoes of that afternoon were sealed inside the Ruby home. Behind drawn curtains, time stood still. Outside, neighbors waved at each other, unaware that love and greed had collided within a single household. The son everyone admired from a distance had turned his gaze inward, toward the inheritance he thought was waiting for him. Alan had grown up watching his father balance a community on his shoulders. The newspaper, the family reputation, the dignity of a man who believed in hard work and fair words. These were things John Ruby protected more fiercely than his own comfort. His wife, gentle but firm, kept the house steady. To them, money was not freedom but responsibility. To Alan, it became something else entirely, proof of worth. Each gift, each allowance, each unearned luxury whispered that success could be worn like a costume. He believed appearance was destiny, and when the mask began to crack, he reached for something irreversible. Those who knew him at the university remembered a charming young man with polished manners, someone who spoke of ambition and travel and fine things. But charm can hide, rot the way perfume hides decay. Beneath every smile was a calculation, a silent equation of what people could give him. His parents' decision to stop funding his endless spending wasn't cruelty. It was an act of hope. They thought discipline might save him. They didn't know that entitlement had already become hunger. When he returned to Duncan under the cover of ordinary weather, he carried not just resentment, but a plan shaped by months of frustration. He believed removing obstacles would bring peace, that money could replace love once love had refused to obey him. He parked far from the house, waiting for quiet, for the rhythm of the neighborhood to settle. Inside the Jeep, his heartbeat echoed the rain. He thought about debts, about promises he couldn't keep, about the way his life would look if no one else stood in his way. In moments like these, motive doesn't form with reason. It grows out of shame and desire until it no longer needs logic. The same hands that once held birthday candles and family photographs would soon hold something far colder. Inside the house, Joy brewed another pot of coffee. Catherine was rinsing soap from her hands. The air carried the familiar scent of home, a smell that would soon become evidence. Later, investigators would reconstruct every detail. They would trace footprints through hallways, examine patterns on walls, mark every position of fallen objects. They would find no signs of forced entry, only familiarity, only trust. That was the hardest part, to understand that the doorway of safety had been opened willingly. After the act, silence ruled. No shouts, no cries reached the neighbors. Alan left the scene with precision, removing anything that might tell the story too quickly. He drove back toward the campus lights, toward the illusion of normal life, carrying nothing but the memory of what he had done. That night, he stood among friends who laughed about weekend plans. They saw nothing strange in his smile. His social mask remained intact, and inside that mask, guilt had not yet taken shape. In Duncan, the lights stayed on in the Ruby house. The world kept turning. The newspaper was delivered as usual. And somewhere on a quiet road, a son convinced himself that he had solved his problems forever. He didn't realize that the rain, steady and unending, was already washing his tracks into the open. The house stood quiet beneath the afternoon sky, blinds half drawn, the air inside growing stale. 4 days had passed since anyone had seen the Ruby family, but in Duncan, people gave space to silence. It wasn't strange for the doors to stay closed a while. Only the housekeeper noticed what the town had not. She parked at the curb, balancing her keys and a list of chores, expecting the usual hum of the refrigerator, the faint radio Joy liked to leave on. When the door opened, A smell she didn't recognize stopped her breath. She called out their names, the sound small against the stillness. No answer came. The rooms were dim, curtains filtering gray light, and something in the air felt wrong. When she reached the kitchen, her voice cracked into a whisper. The phone shook in her hand as she dialed for help, her words trembling. A dispatcher asked what she saw. She could barely say it. The call was recorded, a mixture of shock and disbelief, a voice trying to remain steady while standing in the ruins of a family. Within minutes, patrol cars arrived. Officers stepped carefully through the front door, speaking softly as if loud voices might disturb what was left of peace. They moved with measured pace, marking each room. The living room held the ghost of an ordinary day. Coffee cups on the table, a newspaper folded halfway through, a lamp still burning. It was the kitchen that broke them. Even seasoned officers hesitated, the silence pressing on their chests. The family that had once filled this space with laughter was gone, and the pattern of what had happened lay before them like a map of grief. The state investigators joined soon after. They cordoned the property, collected samples, photographed details, the small things that tell a larger story. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks or shattered windows. Every trace suggested someone who belonged. The precision unsettled them. A crime of strangers is chaotic, but this one felt calculated, personal. Each detail hinted at someone who knew how the family moved, when they were alone, where the valuables were kept. The officers exchanged quiet looks. Outside, rain began again, thin and relentless. The street filled with curious faces behind curtains. Reporters would come later, drawn by whispers of tragedy in a place that rarely made the news. For now, the blue lights reflected on puddles, and the sound of radios murmured across the neighborhood. By nightfall, investigators had a timeline, fragile but forming. They traced recent calls, searched the family's finances, and learned about a son who had been distant, troubled by money. He was away at college, friends said. He had been online, posting photos, smiling at a football game. It didn't fit the pattern of grief. Still, one detective made a note beside his name. Sometimes the calmest face hides the loudest storm. That evening, the county attorney stood outside the taped yard and spoke quietly to reporters. His words were careful, respectful, but one phrase lingered. There were signs of deliberate action. The meaning was clear enough. This was not random. It was chosen. Across the state, the news spread. People who had once read John Hruby's editorials now read headlines about his death. The contrast was too much to grasp. Those who knew him spoke of his patience, his humor, the way he believed small-town journalism still mattered. They spoke of Joy's kindness, of Catherine's easy laugh. They spoke of the son, too, but in softer tones now, unsure of what to say. Late that night, rain washed over the roof again. Inside the police station, detectives compared notes under fluorescent light. They circled a name, underlined it twice, and began the slow process of proving what they already feared. Tomorrow would bring an arrest. The air inside the interview room felt thick, recycled through vents that never seemed to move. Across the metal table sat a young man who had run out of charm. His posture was rehearsed at first, hands folded, eyes steady, the picture of composure. Detectives spoke softly, almost kindly. They knew he expected confrontation, so they gave him quiet instead. The sound of the rain outside the window was the only rhythm between their questions. They began with simple things, the drive from campus, the time he last spoke to his parents, where he spent the weekend. He answered easily, with the confidence of someone who believed words could bend truth. He smiled once or twice, but the officers noticed the way his fingers tapped against his sleeve, a restless code of unease. He told them he had been celebrating, that he had called his family, but received no answer. The detective nodded, taking notes without looking up. Every lie was allowed to breathe before it was cornered. Then came the pause. The detective opened a folder, turned it so the young man could see, and placed a series of photographs in a neat line. They weren't graphic, just silent proof. A living room, a hallway, a kitchen, each one carrying the ghost of what had happened. The young man's eyes flicked toward them, then away. His breath hitched. The officer didn't press. He simply said, "We found your Jeep on the camera near Bent Tree Street." The words hung in the air like dust. Denial came next, practiced and calm. He said others had access to his vehicle. He said he had nothing to hide. But the officers had already found the receipts, the hotel check-ins, the clothing that matched fibers at the scene. They had traced the timeline from his dorm to his family's home and back again. What had started as suspicion had turned into a pattern no alibi could erase. The detective leaned forward, voice low, steady. He told the young man they knew about the debts, about the forged checks, about the inheritance that would have followed if his parents were gone. He reminded him that grief can't be performed without cracks. He reminded him that his social media posts were too bright, too quick. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the room. When he finally spoke, it wasn't a confession so much as surrender. He said he hadn't planned it that way. He said anger had turned into something else. He said he thought it would fix everything. The detective didn't respond, only looked at him with quiet exhaustion. There was no triumph in that moment, no satisfaction, just a hollow understanding of how greed can hollow a soul. The young man's words were written down carefully, line by line. He signed the statement, the pen trembling once before it touched paper. Outside, the rain grew louder, pounding against the roof of the station. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the passing of another evening. Inside the cell where he would wait, he finally sat still. In Duncan, the town began to mourn. Neighbors left candles at the edge of the driveway. The paper he once boasted about printing now carried headlines about the end of his own family. The circle of irony was complete, and the weight of his confession spread across pages that no one wanted to read. When morning came, he looked through the bars and asked a single question: "Will they ever forgive me?" The detective didn't answer. Some questions are too human for law to touch. The courthouse stood beneath a gray sky, its steps glistening from a night of rain. Reporters gathered along the sidewalk, holding umbrellas, whispering to their microphones. Inside, the air smelled of paper and tension. Wooden benches filled slowly with faces from Duncan, people who had shared block parties, church gatherings, and quiet mornings with the Hruby family. They came to see justice, but also to understand how something so unthinkable could be born from familiarity. The young man entered wearing a suit that didn't fit him anymore. The color drained from his face as he scanned the room, searching for anyone who still looked at him without anger. His wrists were bare of cuffs, but heavy with shame. A guard led him to the defense table where his attorney waited, calm and unreadable. Across the aisle, the prosecutor arranged files, each one a portrait of a family undone. Opening statements began softly. The prosecutor spoke not of sensationalism, but of betrayal. She painted the picture of trust violated within the safety of a home, of a father and mother who believed love could cure selfishness, of a sister who never saw danger in her own blood. Each word was chosen to pierce gently, not to shock, but to remind the jury that this was not a story of strangers. The defense countered with quiet reasoning, speaking of mental strain, of impulsive acts born from pressure and fear, but even compassion faltered under the weight of evidence. Witnesses came forward, one after another. Friends described charm that hid desperation. Investigators recounted the methodical work of tracing his path. An officer spoke of the moment he confessed, his voice subdued, his eyes hollow. The courtroom listened in silence, the rain outside marking time like a slow heartbeat. There was no outburst, no theatrics, only the slow unweaving of illusion. When the final day arrived, the prosecutor closed her folder and faced the jury. She asked them to remember the victims not by their final moments, but by their lives. The father's laughter, the mother's patience, the sister's promise of tomorrow. She asked them to see beyond the horror to the human cost of greed. Her words lingered in the air long after she sat down. The jury left the room. Minutes felt like hours, though no clock dared tick aloud. When they returned, every sound vanished except the rustle of papers. The young man kept his head bowed. The verdict came in measured tones, not shouted but spoken with finality. He didn't cry. He simply stared forward, as though watching his own life fold in on itself. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but the gesture found no response. Outside, the crowd stood in rain that refused to stop. Some whispered prayers, others simply shook their heads. Justice had been served, they said, though none felt lighter. The town would carry the weight of this case for years, a reminder that darkness sometimes grows quietly in familiar soil. In the small jail where he would spend the rest of his days, the young man sat by a narrow window. The sound of rainfall followed him still, steady and relentless. For the first time, he had no story left to tell. Only the echo of his own choices filled the silence. Long after the courtroom emptied, Duncan tried to remember how to feel normal again. The small paper John once edited was sold to another family, its new name printed across the masthead, though older residents still called it by his. Each week, people left flowers near the sidewalk where the Hruby house once stood. The grass had grown uneven there, stubborn, refusing to smooth over the scar. Neighbors said the silence was what hurt most. They missed Joy's laughter drifting through open windows, the clatter of Catherine's music as she washed her car, the way John waved from his porch before driving off to work. Grief lingered not in tears, but in the quiet acts of remembering folding newspapers carefully, sweeping driveways a little slower, turning off lights later than usual, just to hold back the dark. In the local church, sermons began to change. The pastor spoke about forgiveness, about the dangerous illusion of control. He never said the family's name, but everyone understood. When the young man was mentioned, it was only in whispers, carried between pews like the wind that never settles. Some said forgiveness was possible. Others believed certain acts cut too deep to mend. But in every conversation, the same question hovered: how could love fail so completely without anyone seeing the cracks? Investigators who had worked the case moved on to other assignments, yet pieces of Duncan stayed with them. One detective kept the photo of the house on his desk, not out of morbidity, but as a reminder that evil can wear ordinary faces. Another visited the graves quietly each spring. None of them sought closure. They knew such a word didn't belong to this kind of story. Years blurred into routine. The young man's name appeared less in headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new faces. But for those who lived nearby, time never washed the memory clean. Sometimes, on stormy nights, people swore they could still hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the soft rhythm of rain against that empty lot, like the echo of a family once alive beneath its roof. In classrooms, teachers began using the story as caution, urging students to speak when they felt cornered, to ask for help before shame turned dangerous. In living rooms, parents hugged their children a little tighter. The town learned, painfully, that tragedy doesn't come wearing a mask. It grows quietly beside us, asking only to be ignored until it's too late. As the rain continued to fall across Duncan, it carried with it something softer than grief, something closer to understanding. Evil, they realized, is not always born. Sometimes it's built, piece by piece, through silence, pressure, and the failure to listen. And maybe healing begins the same way, slowly, with words finally spoken aloud. When the last candle at the memorial flickered out, a woman whispered a prayer for every soul lost to hidden storms. The wind carried her words down the empty street, through the puddles reflecting porch lights. Life, as always, continued. But the town would never again mistake quiet for peace. The storm had rolled across Florida all morning, leaving behind damp air and streets that shimmered under a pale sky. In a small neighborhood north of the city, porch lights glowed even in daylight, a habit of safety learned through whispered fears. Inside one of those homes lived a woman named Kane Marie, expecting her first child, folding laundry while soft music played through the static of an old radio. The sound of the washer, the hum of the ceiling fan, the low murmur of a neighbor mowing the lawn, ordinary peace that should have lasted forever. She had always been the kind to find light in small things. Friends described her laughter as the kind that filled a room and stayed long after she left. She believed in kindness, in giving second chances, even to those who didn't deserve them. That belief, gentle as it was, had become the thread that tied her to a man who mistook love for ownership. He called too often, apologized too late, promised change that never came. People close to her had started to notice bruises hidden beneath sweaters, apologies that sounded rehearsed. When asked if she was safe, she said she was fine. She always said she was fine. The rain began again by late afternoon, drumming softly on the roof as she set the table. Somewhere down the hall, her phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen, a question first, then silence, then another that chilled her. She placed the phone face down and took a deep breath. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer for strength. Outside, a car slowed near the driveway. Later, neighbors would remember hearing nothing unusual. A dog barked once, then stopped. A light flickered behind a curtain, then went dark. It wasn't until morning that concern turned to dread. The door was unlocked, the television still glowing faintly. A cup sat half full on the counter. What remained of her presence felt like a photograph that had lost its color. Detectives arrived quietly, avoiding the noise of sirens. They spoke in low voices, gathering what fragments they could from a scene that told only part of the truth. The absence of struggle, the signs of familiarity, the things left untouched, all pointed toward someone she trusted. In the bedroom, a folded blanket rested beside a baby name list. The paper trembled in the fan's current, the ink smudged by moisture. One officer turned away, unable to finish reading. When word spread through the neighborhood, shock moved faster than rain. Friends gathered in the yard, whispering that she had been planning to leave him, that she had finally told someone she was ready to start over. They spoke of courage too late, and of the warning signs they all saw but didn't want to name. The man she trusted most would later walk into a station, claiming to help with the search. His tone was calm, his hands steady, his story smooth. Yet one detective saw through the calm. noticed the way he avoided looking at the ring on his finger, the faint red mark near his wrist. The questions began. That night, as the town grew quiet again, rain traced lines across every window. Somewhere between guilt and relief, the truth began to surface. It was the same truth too many had seen before: control disguised as love, fear mistaken for care, silence chosen over safety. And beneath it all, a young woman whose bravery came too late to save her, but not too late to teach those who followed. The storm had rolled across Florida all morning, leaving behind damp air and streets that shimmered under a pale sky. In a small neighborhood north of the city, porch lights glowed even in daylight, a habit of safety learned through whispered fears. Inside one of those homes lived a woman named Kane Marie, expecting her first child, folding laundry while soft music played through the static of an old radio. The sound of the washer, the hum of the ceiling fan, the low murmur of a neighbor mowing the lawn, ordinary peace that should have lasted forever. She had always been the kind to find light in small things. Friends described her laughter as the kind that filled a room and stayed long after she left. She believed in kindness, in giving second chances, even to those who didn't deserve them. That belief, gentle as it was, had become the thread that tied her to a man who mistook love for ownership. He called too often, apologized too late, promised change that never came. People close to her had started to notice bruises hidden beneath sweaters, apologies that sounded rehearsed. When asked if she was safe, she said she was fine. She always said she was fine. The rain began again by late afternoon, drumming softly on the roof as she set the table. Somewhere down the hall, her phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen, a question first, then silence, then another that chilled her. She placed the phone face down and took a deep breath. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer for strength. Outside, a car slowed near the driveway. Later, neighbors would remember hearing nothing unusual. A dog barked once, then stopped. A light flickered behind a curtain, then went dark. It wasn't until morning that concern turned to dread. The door was unlocked, the television still glowing faintly. A cup sat half full on the counter. What remained of her presence felt like a photograph that had lost its color. Detectives arrived quietly, avoiding the noise of sirens. They spoke in low voices, gathering what fragments they could from a scene that told only part of the truth. The absence of struggle, the signs of familiarity, the things left untouched, all pointed toward someone she trusted. In the bedroom, a folded blanket rested beside a baby name list. The paper trembled in the fan's current, the ink smudged by moisture. One officer turned away, unable to finish reading. When word spread through the neighborhood, shock moved faster than rain. Friends gathered in the yard, whispering that she had been planning to leave him, that she had finally told someone she was ready to start over. They spoke of courage too late, and of the warning signs they all saw but didn't want to name. The man she trusted most would later walk into a station claiming to help with the search. His tone was calm, his hands steady, his story smooth. Yet one detective saw through the calm, noticed the way he avoided looking at the ring on his finger, the faint red mark near his wrist. The questions began. That night, as the town grew quiet again, rain traced lines across every window. Somewhere between guilt and relief, the truth began to surface. It was the same truth too many had seen before: control disguised as love, fear mistaken for care, silence chosen over safety. And beneath it all, a young woman whose bravery came too late to save her, but not too late to teach those who followed. Fear has a way of becoming routine before anyone calls it by name. For Cain Marie, it began as concern disguised as care, messages that asked where she was, who she was with, when she'd return. At first, it felt like love, someone paying attention, but love does not track footsteps or count minutes. Love does not turn comfort into surveillance. Each question grew sharper until even silence was considered guilt. Her friends noticed the shift before she did, the way she hesitated to answer her phone, the way she smiled too quickly to hide worry. Those who study violence often say it doesn't begin with shouting, but with withdrawal. The victim learns to measure moods like weather, to navigate storms that never make a sound. Cain Marie became fluent in that language, adjusting tone, choosing words that might prevent the next outburst. Her home turned into a map of escape routes, doors she checked twice, windows she kept unlatched. She told herself it was temporary. That change was possible if she only tried harder. The human heart is stubborn that way. It wants to believe in redemption even as it breaks. Her friends planned small interventions disguised as coffee visits, hoping to remind her of who she was before fear settled in. She laughed with them, nodded, promised she'd think about leaving. But behind every promise was hesitation, an invisible chain of hope and habit. Control had rewritten her sense of safety. She began to apologize for things she didn't do, to shrink her world until even joy felt dangerous. Detectives piecing together her final weeks found traces of this quiet suffering everywhere. Texts that sounded rehearsed, bank statements showing sudden withdrawals, neighbors recalling late-night arguments muffled by walls. A counselor's number scribbled on a receipt. Every clue painted a picture of someone trying to reclaim her voice in a world that punished her for speaking. The man at the center of her life, meanwhile, told anyone who would listen that she was overreacting. He played the part of the misunderstood partner, the one who tried his best. In interviews, he smiled too much, using her name like a shield. But behind the calm, there were inconsistencies. Timelines that shifted, stories that contradicted each other, emotions rehearsed but never felt. Investigators learned to read the pauses between his words more than the words themselves. The community began to fracture under the weight of divided sympathy. Some clung to denial. It's hard to accept that someone you know could become capable of harm. Others grew angry, replaying every sign they'd ignored. Her friends started a vigil, holding candles in rain that refused to stop, whispering that they should have done more. In the midst of grief, the truth became clear. Control is not always loud. It whispers through apologies, hides inside good intentions, and feeds on silence. Cain Marie's story forced people to see what they'd rather not: the slow, methodical erosion of self that leaves nothing visible until it's too late. As investigators gathered the final pieces, one detective wrote in her notes that fear leaves fingerprints you can't dust for. It seeps into the air, into the pauses between laughter, into the glance over one's shoulder. And though the case was still far from closed, they already knew the shape of the ending. It had been written long before anyone heard the first cry. Detectives returned to the small house again and again, searching for something that might explain how love had turned fatal. Each time they stepped through the door, the same chill greeted them, the same hum of silence pressed against the walls. They followed patterns, others missed small details like the way the blinds were drawn, the faint mark on the door frame, the open drawer that seemed too deliberate. Everything told a story, but not the one the suspect wanted them to hear. Evidence in cases like this rarely speaks loudly. It whispers through contradictions. The man who claimed he found the door ajar could not explain why his fingerprints were on items that should have belonged only to her. He said he stopped by to check on her, but his phone records painted a different map, one that led straight back to her house during the window of her disappearance. Investigators compared the data, piecing together a timeline that began as coincidence and ended as certainty. In the lab, analysts worked quietly, their gloves brushing against sealed bags, their eyes scanning faint traces invisible to ordinary sight. On the kitchen counter, a cup still held the imprint of her hand. The air inside the container smelled faintly of citrus and sorrow. Forensic technicians examined every object like a confession waiting to be translated. They found nothing dramatic, just fibers, traces, the small residues of shared life that now marked a crime. One detective, a woman who had seen too many stories like this, began to feel the weight of repetition. She remembered other victims whose trust had been weaponized, whose final acts were recorded only in the details they left behind. She spoke softly to her team, reminding them that behind every report was a person who once believed they were safe. Her words carried through the room like a quiet vow. As evidence mounted, the suspect's composure began to crack. During questioning, he leaned forward too quickly, his hands trembling when photographs were placed before him. He denied everything, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition when shown the smallest detail: a phone screen, a keychain, a familiar ring. The detective watched closely, noting each breath, each swallow. Guilt, she knew, often revealed itself not through words but through stillness. The district attorney's office prepared the case carefully, aware that domestic crimes often face skepticism. They gathered expert testimony about cycles of control and escalation, explaining how isolation turns deadly without ever raising a visible alarm. The evidence alone was enough, but the story behind it was what would convince the jury. A woman who had tried to leave, a man who refused to let her exist without him. In the weeks that followed, the case became a mirror for the community. Conversations about safety took on new urgency. Shelters received more calls. Counselors spoke on local radio stations about recognizing the signs too many ignore. Kane Marie's name became more than a tragedy. It became a warning whispered between friends, a symbol of how easily love can become possession when fear is allowed to grow. On the night before the final report was filed, the lead detective stood outside the house for the last time. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with earth and memory. She looked toward the window where a lamp still flickered, left by a neighbor who refused to let darkness win. Some cases end with arrest, others end with understanding. This one, she thought, might offer both. The courthouse smelled faintly of rain-soaked paper and polished wood. People filled the benches early, whispering names they had once spoken with affection. No one wanted to believe that the man seated beside his attorney had once been the center of Kane Marie's world. He sat straight, dressed neatly, face calm in a way that felt rehearsed. The cameras outside waited for spectacle, but inside the walls, grief made its own quiet theater. The prosecution began with a tone of sorrow rather than fury. They spoke of patterns, of control masked as devotion, of how love turns dangerous when one person begins to see another as property. The jury listened, hands folded, expressions caught between disbelief and empathy. Each witness painted the same portrait: a woman shrinking, a man growing louder. Text messages read aloud filled the room with her voice once more, gentle, careful, trying to de-escalate even as her fear deepened. The defense focused on doubt. They said there was no eyewitness, that everything was interpretation, that emotion had replaced reason. They pointed to his tears during interrogation, the tremor in his hands when he spoke of her. Yet each plea for understanding sounded smaller against the evidence. The inconsistencies, the absence of forced entry, the timeline carved too precisely to be accident. A friend took the stand and described the final day they saw Cain Marie. Her words cracked midway through, not from drama, but from exhaustion. She told the court how Cain had chosen a baby name, how she had started packing a small suitcase, how she said this time she was really leaving. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor asked one final question. Did she seem afraid? The answer was a whisper. Yes. When the jury retired to deliberate, the air inside felt suspended. Rain began to fall again, tapping gently against the tall windows. Some jurors stared at their hands, others at the floor. The weight of the decision pressed down not as vengeance but as duty. They returned without fanfare, their faces pale with what they had seen. The verdict came softly, spoken once, final and absolute. He didn't move when it was read. Only his eyes flickered toward the prosecutor, then to the family of the victim. There was no apology, no plea for mercy, just a long exhale, as though he had been waiting for someone else to define what came next. The judge spoke in the same calm rhythm used for every sentence, but those words carried through the room like thunder. Outside, people gathered beneath umbrellas, the sound of rain mixing with murmured prayers. Some cried openly, others simply stood, trying to process the contrast between justice served and life lost. The prosecutor walked past them quietly, refusing interviews, holding only her notes close to her chest. The lead detective stood nearby, eyes red from exhaustion, saying nothing. By the next morning, the courthouse lawn was covered with flowers. Strangers left letters folded into plastic sleeves, addressed to a woman most had never met. Each message carried the same wish that her story would not be repeated. The lamps along the sidewalk stayed lit all night, and for the first time since her disappearance, the town felt still, not because fear had left, but because truth had finally been spoken aloud. When the news faded from television screens, her name remained on the lips of those who refused to forget. Cain Marie became more than a story told under stormlight. She became a measure of courage in small towns where silence had once been mistaken for peace. People began to speak differently about love. They asked harder questions, set clearer boundaries, listened longer when someone said they felt unsafe. Her absence had reshaped the air itself, leaving behind a caution carved in compassion. Her friends started a small foundation in her memory, focused not on tragedy but on prevention. They visited schools, spoke to young women about recognizing the difference between concern and control. They taught how kindness can survive even when trust has been broken. Each gathering ended with a moment of quiet, a way to honor the space where her laughter used to be. The detective who led the case kept a photograph on her desk, not for the crime, but for the light in Cain's eyes. Whenever new files landed in front of her, she looked at that picture and reminded herself that every name in a report once held a heartbeat. The district attorney continued to push for stronger laws protecting victims of domestic harm. Reporters, once chasing headlines, began writing about recovery instead of shock. In the small neighborhood where it began, the house was sold to a new family. They repainted the walls, planted flowers, filled the rooms with noise and movement. Some neighbors said it was healing to hear laughter there again. Others still crossed the street out of habit, unable to face what the house had seen. Healing, like grief, moves at its own pace. One evening, during a thunderstorm that rolled in from the Gulf, a woman passing through stopped her car near that house. She sat for a long moment, watching rain slide down the windshield. Then she whispered a name, barely audible above the wind. It wasn't prayer exactly, it was remembrance, a small vow to live without fear. She started the engine and drove away, carrying that whisper with her. The world outside kept moving, but for those who had known Cain Marie, time remained slightly tilted. They spoke of her when they needed strength, when they warned their daughters about the shape of possessive love, when they held their friends a little longer before saying goodbye. Her story no longer belonged to one tragedy. It had become part of a larger lesson, stitched into the fabric of survival. And somewhere beyond language, perhaps in the rhythm of rain or the flicker of a porch light, her spirit lingered quiet, protective, watching over those who still struggled to leave. The sound of the storm was not frightening anymore. It felt like her voice reminding them that freedom begins the moment you stop apologizing for wanting peace. As the clouds broke and dawn bled into the horizon, the town exhaled. Grief softened into memory. Her name, carried on wind and whispered in kindness, had become eternal. Morning broke softly over Indianapolis, light filtering through thin clouds like a hesitant promise. On a quiet street lined with maple trees, a woman named Amanda prepared for another ordinary day. The scent of coffee lingered in the kitchen, mingling with the faint sound of worship music from a nearby room. She had always greeted mornings the same way, barefoot, thoughtful, her hands resting on her growing belly, whispering words meant for a future still forming. Her husband left early to meet parishioners, the small church they had built together barely large enough to hold all the hearts that trusted them. He kissed her cheek before stepping into the cool air, unaware that this would be the last time he'd feel the warmth of her skin. She waved through the doorway, smiled, then locked it behind him. The house exhaled into stillness, sunlight stretching across the hallway like a blessing that would soon be broken. Amanda believed in goodness even when the world offered little proof. She kept journals filled with gratitude, prayers written in looping script. She believed every soul could be redeemed, even those lost in darkness, that faith would soon face its cruelest test. Across town, a group of men wandered aimlessly through streets they didn't belong to. They carried the smell of exhaustion and danger, their laughter brittle, their purpose unspoken. Crime for them had become habit, an answer to hunger and hopelessness. They didn't know Amanda's name. She was simply a door that might lead to something valuable. When they parked at the edge of her street, rain began to fall again, soft enough to hide footsteps. Inside, Amanda folded laundry, humming along to a song about forgiveness. The dog barked once, restless at a noise beyond the glass. She turned toward the front room, unaware of the shadows moving outside. Later, neighbors would recall hearing nothing unusual, only the faint echo of thunder and a car pulling away. By the time her husband returned that afternoon, the front door was ajar. The world slowed to silence as he stepped inside. The air carried no sound, only a stillness that felt unnatural. He called her name once, then again. There was no answer. The investigators who arrived hours later would remember the calm of that house, the photos on the walls, the warmth of faith still visible in every corner. They moved carefully, speaking softly as if afraid to disturb what had once been sacred. Evidence told a story of intrusion and cruelty, but it also spoke of resilience. Even in her final moments, Amanda had fought to protect the life within her, a mother's instinct stronger than fear itself. That night, the community gathered in the church she helped build. Rain drummed against the roof as candles flickered across the altar. No one spoke for a long time. When they finally did, the words came like prayer and question intertwined. How could grace survive in a world that allowed this? The pastor stood trembling but unbroken. He said, "Faith is not believing that bad things won't happen. It's believing that goodness can rise from the ruins." His voice shook, but his eyes held steady. Outside, lightning flashed across the sky, and in that brief light, it seemed as if Amanda's presence still lingered, gentle, forgiving, eternal. The front door had never been broken before. It stood as a symbol of safety, painted in soft color, often left open to let in morning air. That day, it became the line between faith and fear. When investigators arrived, they noticed how the lock had splintered, how the frame bent inward as if the wood itself had tried to resist. Nothing about the scene looked chaotic, yet every detail whispered intrusion. Inside, the scent of coffee still lingered, mixed with something colder, the metallic tang of violence disguised beneath detergent and rain. The living room held the echo of normal life, a book half read, a mug still warm, a blanket folded neatly across the couch. The small details made the silence heavier. One detective paused by the doorway, his throat tightening. He had seen worse, but not in a home filled with scripture and baby clothes. Neighbors watched from their porches, clutching coats against the wind. They spoke in low voices, disbelief turning into grief before the facts even formed. Amanda had been one of them, friendly, bright, always offering prayer when others struggled. The idea that harm had come through her door felt impossible, but impossibility had already happened. The forensic team moved slowly, their tools clicking softly. Each photograph captured fragments of her last morning. The pattern of footprints on the hallway floor, the smudge of a hand near the kitchen counter, the shattered edge of a picture frame. These were not just clues, but echoes of struggle. They found signs of resistance, faint but undeniable. The fight had been brief and desperate, proof of courage in the face of terror. Outside, rain began again, tracing dark lines down the driveway. Reporters gathered, cameras reflecting the flashing lights. The story spread fast, reaching beyond the city within hours. But inside the tape, it was still heartbreak, not headlines. Detectives whispered updates, piecing together what little they knew. Forced entry, interrupted robbery, confrontation, escape. Yet something about the timing didn't feel right. It wasn't random, it was chosen. In the church later that evening, people gathered in silence. Her husband stood at the altar, his hands trembling but steady enough to light a single candle. He spoke quietly about faith, about how hope isn't the absence of pain, but the courage to keep believing when everything is gone. His words drifted through the sanctuary, fragile and strong all at once. As the night deepened, police canvassed the area, searching for anything shoe prints in mud, a witness who saw movement, a car that didn't belong. Somewhere in the darkness, 3 men hid in plain sight, unaware that the world they had shattered would soon close in on them. At home, the light above Amanda's porch remained on, casting a small circle of gold onto wet concrete. Neighbors said it looked like a vigil that refused to end. Inside that glow, the broken door stood open just enough to catch the wind, creaking softly as though the house itself was trying to breathe. Faith and loss had met at that threshold, and the story was only beginning to unfold. Rain fell harder the next morning, turning the city into a reflection of itself. Police cruisers lined the narrow street, their lights cutting through mist and memory. Inside one of the cars, a detective traced the shape of the neighborhood on a notepad, his eyes fixed on the single house that had changed everything. The crime scene had been cleared, but the air still felt weighted, as though grief clung to every brick. Detectives began the slow process of searching for who had entered the home and why. They walked through alleys slick with water, followed footprints that dissolved in puddles, and reviewed surveillance footage from corner stores. One image showed 3 figures moving together through the rain, hoods drawn, faces half hidden. They looked ordinary until you knew what they had done. Inside the precinct, maps covered the walls, strings connecting addresses and fragments of evidence. Each connection tightened around a small group of men, known for break-ins across the city. One name surfaced again and again, a face that seemed to appear whenever desperation met opportunity. They had chosen homes based on chance before, but this one felt different. Something about the precision of the break-in, the short window of time, suggested planning. The investigation widened. Detectives interviewed neighbors who spoke of a car idling late that morning, of voices near the corner when they should have been silent. Each statement added another thread. Forensic results arrived quietly, pointing toward familiar materials, familiar methods. The team began to see the shape of the truth forming, slow but steady. While the city worked to solve a murder, the church Amanda had loved became a refuge. Candles lined the windowsills. Members brought food, held hands, and prayed even for those who had caused the pain. Her husband's sermons changed tone. He spoke of anger without letting it turn into hate. He said, "Forgiveness doesn't erase justice, it completes it." His words moved through the crowd like rain over dry ground, steady, cleansing, sorrowful. In a nearby apartment, one of the suspects watched the news. The sound was low, the images muted, but something in his expression shifted. He hadn't expected the story to reach so far. He hadn't expected to see her photo, smiling, radiant, the kind of face that looked too kind to belong in a headline. Guilt began to seep through the cracks of bravado. He turned off the television and stared out the window, the city's lights blurring through raindrops. Back at headquarters, a lead detective looked over the collected evidence: shoe impressions, phone records, a fragment of fabric caught in a doorway. Each piece alone meant little. Together, they sang the truth. The warrant came quietly, and by nightfall, doors were broken again, this time by officers instead of thieves. The rain eased as they led the men away. Streetlights flickered across their faces, revealing fear, not defiance. In the stillness that followed, thunder rolled somewhere distant, like a sigh of release from the heavens themselves. At the church that same night, the congregation gathered once more. They prayed not just for Amanda, but for the redemption of those who had destroyed her peace. The pastor's voice trembled as he spoke her name, then fell silent. Sometimes the holiest moment is the quiet that follows when there's nothing left to say. Outside, the storm finally broke. The clouds parted. For a brief moment, the moon shone over the street where she had lived, gentle and forgiving, as if even the sky had decided to remember her kindly. The courthouse felt heavier than stone. Every step along the polished hallway echoed like a prayer unanswered. The faces gathered there had seen months of mourning turn into procedure, pain into testimony. Yet beneath the solemn rhythm of the law, faith still lingered, fragile but unbroken. The husband walked past the cameras with his head lowered, one hand pressed to his heart. Reporters tried to meet his eyes, but he had nothing left to give them except silence. Inside, the courtroom was full. The walls seemed to hum with the quiet breathing of strangers drawn together by tragedy. The defendants sat at the front, heads bowed, expressions unreadable. Behind them, families shifted uncomfortably, torn between rage and fatigue. The prosecutor opened with measured words, describing how a home had been violated, how a woman's faith had met the world's cruelty. No dramatics, no shouting, just the steady cadence of truth. The evidence unfolded like a tapestry woven with grief. A fragment of cloth found at the scene, fingerprints on a handle, the confession of one man too burdened by guilt to keep lying. Each piece reinforced the same story: a robbery gone wrong, a life stolen in moments, a community forever changed. The defense tried to soften the edges, to paint their clients as victims of circumstance, but the weight of what they had done allowed no disguise. When the husband took the stand, the room stilled. He spoke with the voice of someone who had rehearsed every word through sleepless nights. He didn't speak of vengeance. He spoke of faith. He said forgiveness was not a feeling, but a choice repeated every morning. He said his wife had lived, believing that darkness could be redeemed, and he refused to let her death prove her wrong. His words made the courtroom tremble in a way no verdict ever could. The prosecutor's closing argument was brief. She reminded the jury that justice and mercy are not enemies. Justice, she said, gives peace to the living. Mercy belongs to the divine. She asked them to render their decision with both in mind. Then she sat, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched white. Deliberation took less time than anyone expected. When the jurors returned, they avoided the husband's gaze, each of them carrying the invisible weight of finality. The judge spoke slowly, every word striking the air like soft thunder. The verdict came and went, and for a long moment no one breathed. The husband closed his eyes, exhaling not relief but acceptance. Outside, the crowd gathered beneath the courthouse steps. Reporters repeated the verdict into microphones, but the real story lived elsewhere, in the quiet resolve of a man who chose grace over hate, in a congregation that still believed in light despite what darkness had taken. Later that night, as the courthouse emptied, the pastor walked alone to the altar where Amanda's photo rested beside a single candle. He whispered her name, then prayed for the men who had ended her life. He prayed that they might one day understand the difference between mercy and freedom. The flame wavered, then steadied, as if answering him. Rain began again before dawn, washing the courthouse steps clean. And somewhere between grief and grace, the world kept turning. After the verdict, the city seemed to breathe again. The rain slowed, the clouds lifted, and sunlight returned to the quiet street where Amanda once lived. Her husband stood on the porch for the first time in months, the same porch where she had watered flowers and laughed at passing neighbors. The wind carried the faint smell of earth after a storm, a scent that always made her smile. He closed his eyes and whispered a promise to live in a way that kept her kindness alive. The church she helped build became more than a sanctuary. It turned into a monument of healing. People came not only to mourn but to listen, to speak of loss without shame, to learn that faith can survive even when its vessel is gone. The walls held hymns that trembled with both sorrow and gratitude. The pastor's sermons no longer asked why, only how to forgive, to rebuild, to keep believing when nothing feels certain. Each year, when the sky grew gray with rain, the congregation gathered for a vigil. They sang softly, candles flickering like fragile stars in the sanctuary. The husband would stand near the altar, sometimes speaking, sometimes just listening. He never spoke of justice anymore. He spoke of grace. He said grace was what remains when everything else has been taken. The words settled over the crowd like a blanket against the chill. The men who had caused the tragedy disappeared behind prison walls, but their names still appeared in his prayers. People couldn't understand how he could forgive them. He explained that forgiveness was not letting them go free. It was letting himself breathe again. The community watched him and saw something beyond endurance. They saw faith not as belief but as a decision, made daily, to love in spite of ruin. In her memory, the church opened a small foundation supporting mothers in need. Her handwriting was engraved on the entrance plaque, a simple phrase she once wrote in her journal: "Love first, even when it hurts." Visitors touched the words as they passed, finding comfort in her message. One evening, the husband returned to the empty house. The air was still, the rooms untouched since that day. He walked through the hallway slowly, fingers brushing over photographs, stopping at one of her smiling beneath an open sky. He felt no anger, no despair, only quiet, the same quiet she used to pray in before dawn. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall again, soft and rhythmic. He sat on the porch and let it wash over him, whispering a verse she had once loved about finding peace after storms. The world around him blurred, not from tears but from light reflecting off rain. For a moment, he could almost feel her beside him, not as ghost but as memory fulfilled. In that stillness, he understood that grace is not an ending, but a return to hope, to kindness, to faith that does not break. The storm had come and gone, but the love she left behind had learned how to stay. Russellville was the kind of town where everyone noticed when a porch light stayed on too long. The air smelled of pine and rain, streets curved past quiet houses that seemed untouched by time. Nona lived there while chasing her dream, a young woman whose voice filled rooms before her presence even reached the door. She studied hard, loved music, and kept her life neat in a world that rarely rewarded kindness. Her apartment was small but full of light, lined with photos and sticky notes that reminded her to believe in herself. The last evening anyone saw her alive, rain had started early. Friends said she looked tired but happy, preparing for an upcoming performance. She waved goodnight and promised to call later. No one worried she was safe in her own home, surrounded by the comfort of routine. But routine can turn fragile in an instant. The next day, when she didn't answer her phone, people began to feel uneasy. A friend stopped by, knocking softly, calling her name through the door. Silence. Inside, a television hummed against the wall, a faint echo of normal life. When the door finally opened, the air inside felt wrong, thick, heavy, filled with something that didn't belong. What they found ended innocence for an entire town. The investigation began before grief had time to take shape. Detectives moved through the apartment quietly, marking every surface, photographing every corner. The scene was disturbing but confusing. Signs of struggle existed, but none pointed clearly to a single story. Objects lay displaced, yet nothing of value seemed taken. There was violence, but also calculation, as if the chaos had been composed. Whispers spread faster than evidence. People spoke of jealousy, betrayal, secrets that didn't exist. The media arrived, turning the small street into a spectacle. Friends were questioned. Classmates became suspects. Even those who loved her most felt the weight of suspicion. The investigation began to divide the town, not between good and evil, but between what people wanted to believe and what they feared might be true. One detective wrote in his notes that truth had edges too sharp to hold. He could see fragments of stories, each cutting in a different direction. Forensic results pointed one way, emotions another. Her boyfriend became the center of every headline, his grief dissected by strangers, his words replayed and doubted. He cried openly, but the town's sympathy turned to skepticism. The line between mourning and guilt blurred in the eyes of those desperate for certainty. The case should have been simple. It became a maze instead. Evidence contradicted itself. Testimonies overlapped like rain on glass. The truth hid somewhere between fingerprints and rumor, between what was seen and what people wanted to see. As days passed, Nona's name turned from person to symbol, a mystery too tangled to solve cleanly. The town held vigils, candles flickering beneath umbrellas, yet beneath every prayer was a question no one dared speak aloud. Who could do such a thing, and why did it feel like everyone might have? That night, rain poured hard enough to wash chalk from the sidewalks. In the police station, an officer stared at photographs spread across his desk. Each image showed the same room from a different angle, each revealing and concealing at once. He whispered to himself, not sure if it was hope or fear, that the truth would surface soon. But in Russellville, truth had already learned how to hide. The search for the truth turned inward, toward the people closest to Nona. Her boyfriend became the first to stand beneath the fluorescent glare of suspicion. The police station smelled of old coffee and rain-soaked uniforms as he sat across from detectives, his eyes red but defiant. They asked him to tell his story again and again. He spoke softly, voice cracking, repeating that he had found her, that he wished he hadn't opened that door. The words sounded real, yet grief and guilt often sound the same. Detectives studied his every gesture, every pause between sentences. They noted how his hands trembled when photographs appeared on the table. He wept when they asked about their last conversation, but they couldn't decide if it was sorrow or fear. Someone wrote in the margin of the report, truth or performance. They needed evidence, not emotion. Forensic teams combed through the apartment again, this time slower, more deliberate. They found traces that seemed to belong to him, but also to others. DNA clung to objects used by many, fingerprints overlapped until none could be called pure. The scene spoke in riddles. Some evidence fit too perfectly, other pieces fit nowhere. When prosecutors reviewed the file, they felt unease rather than confidence. The case was heavy with details, but light on certainty. Outside the courthouse, the town divided. One half wanted closure, demanding a name to blame. The other half whispered that something didn't add up. The press fed both sides, crafting stories that blurred fact and speculation. Each article painted a new version of truth until no one could tell which one was real. Nona's family stood between despair and outrage. They wanted justice, yet they feared the wrong person would pay for what had happened. They attended every hearing, their faces pale beneath the harsh lights. The boyfriend avoided their gaze, shoulders slumped, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. When he left the building, cameras followed, their flashes slicing through the drizzle like lightning. Another name began to surface, a man from her neighborhood, known to police for small crimes, often seen wandering near her building. He denied knowing her, but his timeline faltered under questioning. Witnesses spoke of seeing someone like him near her apartment, though none could say for certain. The police found objects in his home that echoed the crime scene, but not enough to seal his fate. The investigation began to twist upon itself, chasing shadows that looked like truth. Inside the detective's office, the lead investigator stared at two profiles pinned side by side. Both men had motives, both had gaps in their stories, both could have done it. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of every unsolved case pressing down. Somewhere in that room, the answer existed, hidden in plain sight. But the truth refused to speak clearly. As months passed, public interest turned restless. The town wanted a villain more than it wanted proof. The boyfriend's name became a curse whispered in grocery aisles, while the other suspect drifted in and out of custody. Justice felt like fog, visible yet untouchable. One night, the detective returned to the apartment alone. The tape was gone, the walls repainted, but the air still held memory. He stood in the center of the room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of settling floorboards. He whispered her name once, hoping for some sign, some truth that might finally step out of the shadow. Only rain answered, steady and endless, as if the sky itself refused to let this story rest. The courtroom became a stage for uncertainty. Every word spoken there carried the weight of two stories, each claiming to be the truth. The prosecutor stood firm, presenting evidence that seemed to point in one direction. The defense countered with gaps too wide to ignore. The jurors sat in silence, watching as science and doubt collided in the space between testimony and memory. Nona's mother sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She listened without blinking, refusing to cry in public anymore. Her daughter's photograph lay flat on the bench beside her, a silent reminder of why they were all there. Behind her, the town whispered through the proceedings, shifting between outrage and confusion. Some believed the boyfriend guilty. Others believed the state had chosen the easiest target. Detectives who once felt certain now questioned their own findings. The lab results contradicted themselves, timelines bent under scrutiny. A single piece of evidence that should have clarified everything only deepened the fog. It was as though the truth itself had decided to stay hidden, mocking their determination. The defense called its witnesses, friends, neighbors, experts. They spoke of inconsistencies, of missing files, of pressure to close the case quickly. The prosecutor objected, voice sharp, frustration bleeding through control. The judge reminded both sides that justice was not a race, but everyone in the room knew time was the real enemy. The longer it dragged, the more the public lost faith. Outside, reporters waited in the rain, their voices steady but eyes weary. They had covered the case from the beginning, but each new headline sounded more uncertain than the last. The story had stopped being about one victim. It had become a reflection of how fragile truth can be when pulled between human hands. When the verdict was read, there was no sense of victory. One man walked free, another took his place under suspicion. The town erupted in argument, friendships fractured, and the courthouse steps filled with people shouting two different definitions of justice. The sound echoed off wet stone and into the night. Inside the small police office, the lead investigator sat alone, papers scattered across his desk. He traced lines from one suspect to another, circling names, crossing them out, starting again. He thought of Nona, of the life she should have lived, of how she had become a ghost haunting both sides of the law. He wondered if the real truth had been lost forever, buried beneath pride and error. Her family returned home after the hearing, carrying exhaustion that no verdict could ease. They placed her photograph on the mantel, beside a candle that burned low through the night. Her mother whispered that justice should feel clean, but this one felt muddy, unfinished. The flame flickered, as though agreeing. As dawn arrived, the streets of Russellville were silent except for the drip of rain from gutters. The town had its answer on paper, but none in its heart. In homes and diners and police stations, people replayed the case like a song that never resolved. Somewhere, the real story still waited, quiet, patient, untouched by noise. And in that stillness, doubt became the only truth left standing. Months passed before anyone dared reopen the file. The pages had yellowed slightly at the edges, photographs stacked between reports that no longer smelled of ink but of time. A new investigator, younger but cautious, began to read through everything again. She had not lived through the first wave of accusation, had not watched the town divide, and because of that, she carried no loyalty except to the truth. Her first impression was silence, the kind that hides between lines, not in words. She noticed small things others had missed. The timeline of the boyfriend's movements, the way one statement contradicted another, the fingerprint that was dismissed because it seemed out of place. She pinned them all to a board, building a new picture from fragments everyone else had grown too tired to see. It wasn't about finding someone to blame anymore. It was about untangling the mess left behind by certainty that had never been real. As she worked, The town whispered again. Some said reopening the case would only reopen wounds. Others welcomed it, hoping the shadow over Nona's name would finally lift. The detective visited her mother, sitting in a living room filled with soft light and photographs. The woman spoke gently, her grief worn but dignified. She said she didn't need revenge, only peace. The detective promised nothing but effort, and that seemed enough. Evidence was retested, files re-examined, interviews replayed with new technology that could detect hesitations hidden in speech. Patterns began to shift. Where once the story seemed to point in one direction, it now turned. A neighbor's account, dismissed years ago, suddenly aligned with data no one had noticed before. A memory described under oath now sounded rehearsed. Truth began to whisper again, faint but insistent. Meanwhile, the boyfriend lived quietly far from Russellville, his life frozen in the moment the world decided who he was. He avoided interviews, avoided the internet, but one night he answered a call from a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to the new investigator. She spoke calmly, telling him she was reviewing the case, that she needed him to walk her through that night once more. There was a long pause before he agreed. The next morning, he met her in a small office, his eyes haunted but open. He told the story again, every detail, every sound, every fear. She listened without judgment, her notes filling slowly. When he finished, she asked a question no one had asked before, a simple question about something ordinary, something overlooked. His answer shifted the timeline just enough to make everything uncertain again. The report she wrote afterward didn't name a new suspect. It didn't clear anyone completely. It simply stated that the original case was incomplete. For the first time, the official record admitted what everyone already knew. The truth was still missing. When the news reached the town, there was no outrage, no shouting, only a long collective sigh. People had lived too long in tension to feel shock anymore. They gathered quietly outside the old courthouse, holding candles that flickered in the evening wind. Nona's mother stood among them, eyes closed, whispering her daughter's name like a prayer. The rain started again before the vigil ended. Drops fell on candle flames, extinguishing them one by one, leaving smoke curling upward like unanswered questions. The crowd didn't move. They stood beneath the downpour, letting the rain soak through, as if surrendering to the truth's refusal to be found. Inside her small office, the detective looked at the photographs one last time. She didn't feel defeat, only respect. Some truths, she thought, are not meant to end. They are meant to remind us that justice is a pursuit, not a possession. Outside, thunder rumbled low and distant, promising that the story was not finished. In the evidence room, the lights buzzed softly above shelves, lined with boxes that held the remnants of lives interrupted. Dust clung to the corners of labels written by hands that had long since moved on. Among them sat one box marked with Nona's name. Inside were photographs, reports, fragments of things once ordinary: a notebook, a broken charm, a letter she never sent. The new detective lifted each piece as if it might breathe, careful not to disturb the stillness that had settled over the case. She found herself studying the photographs again, not for answers, but for emotion. The arrangement of a lamp, the placement of shoes near the bed, the small note pinned to a wall, reminded her that evidence is not just proof but presence. Forensics tells how, but memory whispers why. And in that whisper, she began to sense something larger than guilt or innocence. When she visited the college where Nona had studied, she walked through hallways still lined with posters fading under sunlight. A few professors remembered her, speaking with the same ache that comes when time refuses to heal. They described a young woman determined yet gentle, ambitious yet grounded. One of them said the world owed her more than this silence. The detective nodded, unable to disagree. She returned to the town and met with the older officers who had once led the investigation. They spoke cautiously, as if reopening old wounds might summon ghosts. Some admitted mistakes, others defended their choices. One of them said they had followed the facts as best they could with what they had, but facts without context can mislead as easily as lies. She wrote that sentence down. It stayed with her. In the years since the murder, technology had changed, methods improved, yet the heart of the work remained human. Machines could read traces of DNA invisible to the eye, but they couldn't read fear, regret, or love. The detective realized that every case is a mirror, reflecting not only what happened, but who we are when faced with uncertainty. Late one evening, she sat alone reviewing her notes. The rain outside came steady and rhythmic, a sound she had learned to associate with clarity. She flipped through the photographs once more, focusing on details others might have ignored: the angle of a curtain, the way light pooled near the window. Then she noticed something in a reflection, faint but strange. An object that hadn't been logged, perhaps too subtle to notice before. She leaned closer, tracing its shape with her finger. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was something new. The next morning, she brought it to her team. They rechecked the archives, found an overlooked entry, and realized a piece of physical evidence had been stored separately years earlier. It didn't rewrite the story, but it filled a small gap, confirming a movement, a timeline, a presence once doubted. It wasn't closure, but it was direction. Word spread quietly through the department. Hope, cautious and fragile, returned to a case thought dead. Reporters caught the scent but found no statement, only locked doors and tired smiles. The town didn't want another circus. It wanted peace. That night, the detective walked past Nona's old apartment. The building had new tenants now, laughter spilling from the windows. For the first time, she didn't feel haunted. She felt guided. Some stories, she realized, keep calling us back not to torment us, but to teach us what persistence means. The rain followed her home, light and steady, a sound that no longer felt mournful. Somewhere between science and faith, the truth was still breathing. It just needed someone willing to listen long enough to hear it. Justice had come and gone too many times for Russellville to believe in it without hesitation. Each new headline reopened an old scar. Each rumor brought back the same ache. The courthouse still stood firm, but to those who passed it daily, the building no longer meant truth. It meant memory, fatigue, and the endless turning of a wheel that refused to stop. When the case resurfaced once more, reporters gathered with practiced patience. They no longer sought revelation, they sought endurance. The same faces reappeared, attorneys older now, detectives whose hair had grayed, witnesses weary of their own stories. Each side carried the same argument, shaped by time but unchanged in soul. One insisted that the first suspect had been wronged. The other demanded closure for a family that had waited too long. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with the smell of paper and wet coats. Nona's mother sat quietly, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes open but distant. She no longer expected answers. She came because not coming would feel like betrayal. Across the aisle, the accused stared down at his folded hands. A man who had lived too long under the shadow of maybe. The judge's gavel echoed, but no one believed the sound could bring order to the chaos that lived in their hearts. Testimonies repeated themselves, voices tired, memories warped by years of retelling. Some details had grown sharper in recollection, Others had faded into fiction. One expert spoke of probability, another of doubt. The jury listened politely, but confusion settled over them like fog. Truth was not the language being spoken here anymore. It was something older, something quieter like grief refusing to die. Outside, the town split again. Some people argued that reopening the case was a waste, that the living deserved rest more than the dead deserved closure. Others said truth has no expiration. They left candles along the courthouse steps, a line of trembling flames against the drizzle. Children asked their parents who Nona was, and the answers came soft and unsure. She had become part of the town's mythology, both real and unreachable. When the latest decision arrived, it changed little. Another appeal, another hearing promised. The cycle continued, feeding on itself. The judge's words were lost beneath the murmur of the crowd, leaving the room, the shuffle of papers, the closing of umbrellas outside. The detectives who had followed this case for years stood in the hallway afterward, speaking quietly about retirement, about peace, about how some cases never end, they simply fade into the next generation's burden. Later that night, the new investigator visited Nona's grave. The cemetery lay still, except for the sound of rain against leaves. She knelt beside the stone, tracing the engraved letters with her thumb. She whispered that the work wasn't done, that even if the law stopped, memory wouldn't. A gust of wind swept through, bending the candles left by strangers, but not extinguishing them. Back in town, windows glowed faintly behind curtains. The storm moved east, leaving puddles that mirrored streetlights. The trial might never end on paper, but within each heart it already had replaced by the quiet acceptance that truth, like grief, is not something we win. It's something we learn to live beside. As dawn crept over Russellville, the courthouse stood unchanged, but the people within its shadow began to move differently. They spoke softer, listened longer. In the echoes of a case that refused to close, they found something close to understanding, and maybe that was the closest thing to justice the town would ever know. When the last motion was filed and the courthouse emptied, Russellville fell quiet again. The rain that had followed every chapter of the case returned one final time, gentle as breath against glass. In that hush, the town finally began to grieve, not for the verdicts that changed nothing, but for the years spent chasing ghosts. Justice had become a rhythm too familiar to inspire belief, but remembrance still had power. It lingered in the way people spoke her name, softer now, no longer seeking explanation. Nona's apartment had long been repainted and rented to strangers. The new tenants never knew the history of the walls, yet sometimes they said the place felt different when it rained. The air grew still, as if holding its breath. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps memory refuses to leave the places it once called home. Across town, her mother kept the same living room, the same lamp on the table beside the framed photograph. Each morning, she dusted it, whispering a few words before starting her day. They weren't prayers anymore, just conversations between worlds. The young investigator who had reopened the case visited often. She brought no updates, only company. The two women sat together in the quiet, sipping coffee, watching the sky change through the window. They rarely spoke about the trial. Instead, they talked about Nona's favorite songs, her college plans, the color she had wanted to paint her kitchen. In these small stories, the girl returned, alive again for a few moments, unburdened by evidence. Over time, the story of Nona became less about the crime and more about endurance. Teachers used her case to discuss integrity, journalists to discuss responsibility, counselors to discuss the fragility of young hope. Her name no longer lived in court records, It lived in lessons whispered gently to those still learning how cruel and kind the world can be. One evening, during a memorial held quietly by candlelight, the pastor spoke of forgiveness not as absolution, but as release. He said the human heart cannot carry endless grief without breaking, and that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. The congregation nodded, faces shining with rain and waxlight. Outside, thunder rolled once, low and distant, like the sound of something old finally settling. Later that night, the investigator walked alone through the town square. The air smelled of rain and pine, the same scent that had marked the beginning. She looked up at the courthouse clock glowing faintly through mist. The hands kept moving, indifferent to truth, to pain, to the stories that filled its halls. Yet beneath that indifference, she felt something fragile, a sense that the work had mattered, even if it never ended neatly. She turned toward the river, watching ripples catch the streetlight. Somewhere behind her, a wind chime rang from a porch. The sound reminded her of laughter she had never heard, but somehow knew belonged to Nona. She closed her eyes and smiled, just once. In Russellville, the rain finally stopped before dawn. Windows opened, fresh air drifted in, and for the first time in years, the town didn't flinch at silence. It wasn't peace exactly, but something close, a balance between what was lost and what had been learned. The past remained heavy, but no longer unbearable. It had become part of the rhythm of life itself, an echo turned into understanding. The ocean was calm that morning, its surface smooth as glass beneath a pale horizon. The port was already alive, with engines rumbling, ropes tightening, and gulls crying above the scent of salt and diesel. Among the crew boarding the vessel was Paige, a young woman with restless eyes and a notebook always tucked under her arm. She had come to the sea, searching for direction, for a life beyond the small routines that had started to suffocate her. She believed the water could wash away confusion. It would, but not in the way she hoped. She worked hard, smiled often, and wrote in her journal every night. Her words were gentle, almost childlike in their hope. She loved the rhythm of the waves, the strange quiet between ports, the sense of being nowhere and everywhere at once. The men she worked with teased her at first, calling her dreamer, but they grew to respect her focus. She followed rules, stayed cautious, never stepped out of line. That discipline made what happened next all the more haunting. The last time anyone saw her, she was standing at the railing before dawn, staring toward the horizon. Some said she was crying, others said she looked peaceful. The truth, as with everything about Paige, remains uncertain. When she didn't appear for breakfast, no one worried right away. The ocean is a place of solitude. People often seek a moment alone. But when the hours passed and her cabin stayed untouched, unease settled over the ship like fog. The captain ordered a search. Crew members scoured every deck, calling her name into wind that gave no reply. The sea stretched endlessly, indifferent. Personal belongings remained neatly arranged in her cabin, journal closed, bunk made, shoes placed side by side. No signs of struggle, no farewell letter, just absence, pure and silent. When the vessel docked, authorities boarded immediately. They questioned every sailor, reviewed logs, checked security footage that showed little more than shadows and tide. Her disappearance became the latest mystery whispered along the docks, another story swallowed by the ocean. Her family arrived soon after, faces drawn, clutching photographs that would soon decorate bulletin boards and screens. The investigation spread across borders, tangled in maritime law and jurisdiction. Everyone wanted answers. No one agreed on who should find them. Officials pointed fingers, agencies stalled, and time began to erase what evidence the sea had kept. The ocean gives, but it takes faster. Witnesses contradicted one another. Some described arguments, others denied them. One sailor claimed he had seen Paige writing a letter late at night, but the letter was never found. Her mother refused to let the case fade. She spoke to reporters with quiet strength, describing her daughter not as a victim, but as a voice the sea hadn't silenced yet. Her persistence drew attention, turning a single disappearance into a conversation about safety, about the lives of those who work where no borders exist. As weeks turned into months, ships came and went from the same port, waves rolling over the same waters. The world moved on, but the sound of Paige's name still lingered whenever storms gathered on the horizon. Sailors swore that during heavy weather, they heard a woman's voice carried by the wind, soft, pleading, and calm. At the edge of the pier, her mother still visited, dropping a flower into the tide each time. She would watch it drift until it vanished, whispering that someday the sea would return what it took. The waves answered with their endless rhythm, steady, eternal, refusing either denial or confession. The investigation began where the tide met the shore. Each report carried the same uneasy rhythm. Missing at sea, no witnesses, no trace. Maritime authorities opened inquiries that drifted between nations, lost among translations and signatures. The ocean, vast and impartial, held its silence. For those searching for Paige, silence was the cruelest evidence of all. Her mother met with officials again and again, moving from office to office like a pilgrim, seeking faith in a system built on paperwork. Every interview ended with apologies and uncertainty. One investigator told her that accidents happen, that sometimes people simply vanish. She answered with the same quiet conviction, "My daughter did not fall." That sentence became her anchor. Meanwhile, journalists began to dig. They found inconsistencies in the ship's records, gaps in security footage, testimonies rewritten under pressure. Some crew members had been reassigned, others unreachable. Rumors began to swirl about misconduct, about a confrontation that had taken place days before she disappeared. The company denied everything. The captain refused interviews. And through it all, the sea kept rolling, covering secrets under miles of blue. Forensic teams examined what little evidence existed. Her belongings sealed in plastic, fingerprints faint from salt, fibers clinging to fabric. Nothing spoke clearly. The ocean erases faster than any human can record. But even absence can tell a story. Experts noticed that certain items were missing: a jacket she always wore, a pendant never found. Those details, though small, hinted at something deliberate. A private investigator joined the search, hired by the family. He was patient and weathered, the kind of man who trusted instinct more than protocol. He interviewed the remaining crew one by one, noting contradictions, tracking body language. Some avoided his eyes, others spoke too quickly. He returned to the port each night, exhausted but certain the truth was close. The breakthrough came not from confession, but from logistics. Ship logs showed small edits after the voyage, times rewritten to match official narratives. The investigator followed those discrepancies, tracing them to a single officer who had since disappeared from record. When finally found, the man denied wrongdoing, but couldn't explain why his version of events differed from everyone else's. His silence was as revealing as speech. As the story reached the press, public attention grew fierce. Activists demanded reform, pointing to systemic neglect in maritime labor. They said Paige's case wasn't isolated, it was part of a pattern of stories buried under waves. Politicians spoke briefly, promising review, their words dissolving as quickly as the next tide. Yet, something had shifted. People were listening. At night, The investigator returned to the pier, the same place where her mother still brought flowers. He stood beside her without speaking. The wind carried the smell of salt and rust, the same scent Paige must have breathed before vanishing. Her mother looked at him and asked if the sea ever gives back what it takes. He answered softly, "Sometimes, when someone refuses to stop asking." They stood there as the waves rolled in, each one breaking with a sound like a heartbeat. The ocean, endless and cold, seemed to pause before swallowing another secret. Somewhere beneath its surface, truth drifted weightless, patient, waiting for the right current to carry it home. The ocean doesn't keep secrets out of malice. It keeps them because it has nowhere to place them. Each wave that folds into the next carries a memory, but the current decides which ones reach the shore. Paige's disappearance became one of those drifting truths, torn between the reach of human law and the pull of the sea. Her mother continued her search, even when officials stopped returning calls. She walked the pier with the same rhythm as the tides, marking time by weather instead of calendars. The salt in the air stung her skin, but she said it made her feel closer to her daughter. Reporters stopped asking questions, yet she kept answering them anyway, speaking to anyone who would listen. It wasn't defiance, it was faith that stories keep people alive. The private investigator pushed deeper, confronting the maritime company again. In a sterile office smelling of paper and disinfectant, executives repeated phrases polished by lawyers. They said there was no evidence of foul play, that safety protocols had been followed. He listened, nodded, and asked one question that unsettled the room. If there was no fault, why so much fear? Silence settled thicker than the humidity outside. He collected fragments of truth like shells along the beach, emails sent too late, maintenance logs rewritten, testimonies altered under guidance. Each piece alone meant little, but together they suggested negligence, maybe worse. He handed his findings to officials who promised review. Weeks passed, and nothing changed. Bureaucracy, like the tide, moved in circles. Across the ocean, sailors on other ships began whispering about Paige. They said her name when storms rose without warning, when equipment failed for no reason. Some claimed they heard footsteps on empty decks, soft as breath. The sea is full of superstition, and ghosts are simply stories too heavy to sink. The investigator wrote one final report, knowing it might never see court. He ended it not with accusation, but with warning that silence protects the powerful more than the sea ever could. He mailed a copy to her mother, who placed it beside the photograph on her mantel. The pages smelled faintly of brine, as if they had already touched the water. In time, her case reached a hearing. Officials spoke in formal tones about jurisdiction, liability, and reform. Words like safety and accountability floated through the air, but none felt solid. A new regulation passed quietly, buried in maritime code. It required stricter logging, clearer records, better training. Paige's name was never mentioned, yet her absence had written it between the lines. That evening, her mother returned to the shore. The sunset painted the waves gold and crimson. She knelt and whispered that she no longer asked for justice, only truth. The tide moved toward her feet, then pulled away as if listening. She let the wind lift her hair, eyes closed, mouth curved into something almost like peace. The investigator stood a few yards behind, watching her silhouette against the horizon. He thought of how the sea mirrors us, vast, unpredictable, full of beauty and danger. It doesn't forgive or condemn, it endures. He understood then that finding Paige had never meant recovering remains. It meant refusing to let her story drown. As darkness fell, the first star appeared above the water. The wind carried her mother's whisper into the night, blending with the rhythm of waves. Somewhere far beyond sight, a current shifted, gentle and deliberate, as if the ocean itself had finally begun to answer. Morning returned to the coast with light soft as salt spray. Fishing boats moved through calm water, their engines low, leaving thin white trails that disappeared before reaching the horizon. For the first time in years, the harbor felt alive without tension. Yet beneath the hum of work and routine, the memory of Paige still drifted like fog that never fully lifted. Her name no longer filled headlines, but it lived quietly in the rules rewritten because of her absence. The new laws required accountability where there had been none. Ships now logged every change of watch, every movement at port, every incident, however small. Inspectors began to visit unannounced. Some sailors complained about paperwork. Others said it made them feel safer. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was real. A ripple started by one life that refused to vanish completely. Her mother attended the first memorial service hosted by the Reform Group. It was held near the dock where Paige had last boarded. There were no speeches, only readings from families who had also lost someone to the sea. They spoke of waiting, of faith, of learning to live beside uncertainty. The wind carried their words across the water, scattering them like petals. When it was her turn, she didn't read from notes. She simply said her daughter's name and let silence follow. Reporters asked if she believed justice had been served. She smiled faintly and said justice is a word for courtrooms. Truth is what the heart accepts when courts fall silent. She thanked the investigator, who stood a few steps away, and the sailors who now carried emergency radios on their belts because of her campaign. Then she turned toward the horizon and whispered something the microphones couldn't catch. The investigator continued his work, taking on other cases, but carrying this one like a compass. He often returned to the coast during storm season, standing by the water until rain blurred the world to gray. He said the sea no longer frightened him. It reminded him of how fragile and miraculous survival could be. Whenever the wind rose, he thought of Paige, her voice, her notes, her trust that the ocean could cleanse instead of consume. Years blended into one another, and the world moved forward. The harbor changed owners, ships changed names, but the sea stayed the same, vast, untamed, always returning. Local children grew up hearing her story, not as tragedy, but as reminder. That silence is dangerous, that safety requires persistence, that every rule protecting life was written in someone's loss. On the anniversary of her disappearance, her mother returned alone. The water was calm, the sky pale with early light. She scattered a handful of white flowers and whispered a line from her daughter's journal that had survived salt and time. The sea is not cruel. It's just honest. The petals drifted outward, caught in the current. She watched until they vanished, her face calm, her shoulders eased. Behind her, the first wave of the morning touched the shore. It rolled over footprints and shells, leaving the sand smooth again. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another ship began its journey, its logbook waiting for the first entry. And though the world would never know exactly what became of Paige, it had learned what she left behind: change, compassion, and the courage to keep asking questions even when the answers sleep beneath the waves. Good evening. If you are still here, still listening, it means you have walked with me through every shadowed street and every quiet room. You have heard the names, felt the storms, and seen how easily ordinary lives can be undone by moments that should never have happened. Tonight, the rain has stopped, but its rhythm still lingers, like memory that refuses to fade. Each story carried a lesson hidden beneath sorrow. Alan Hruby showed how greed devours love when it's mistaken for freedom. Kane Marie taught that silence in the face of control can be fatal, and that courage sometimes comes too late but still matters. Amanda Blackburn reminded us that faith can hold even when the world breaks its promise. Nona Dirksmeyer's story revealed how truth can drown beneath the noise of certainty and still survive in persistence. And Paige Bell's disappearance proved that even the sea listens when someone keeps asking. These lives, separated by miles and years, share a single thread: our need to make sense of loss. We tell these stories not to reopen wounds, but to keep the memory of compassion alive. Each investigation, each courtroom, each unanswered question reminds us that justice is not an end but a voice, a whisper that insists someone must keep caring. Forensic work gathers facts, but empathy gathers meaning. Beneath every report is a heartbeat. Beneath every name, a world that once laughed, dreamed, argued, and hoped. It is easy to become numb to tragedy, but if you listen closely, every story carries a plea. Remember me not by how I died, but by how I lived. Tonight, imagine the rain outside your window. It's softer now, more forgiving. Somewhere, a detective locks a case file, a family lights a candle, a mother whispers her child's name into the dark. The sound of that whisper travels farther than we know. It becomes part of the world's quiet promise to keep trying, to keep learning, to keep loving in the face of cruelty. As you lie there, hearing the hum of your own room, know this: evil will always exist, but so will grace. The line between them is drawn every day by how we choose to act, how we choose to see one another. The stories you've heard tonight are not meant to haunt. They are meant to hold you in the truth that compassion is stronger than fear. So, when you wake tomorrow, remember them. Not the pain, but the persistence. Not the ending, but the light that remained. Another file waits somewhere. Another story of loss and courage. But for tonight, let's leave the lamp burning for those who never made it home. Sleep well, and if you dream, may it be of calm water, open roads, and voices finally at peace.